Welcome to Reclassified. What do you call an almost ethereal existence, hypothesized to exist somewhere within the human body? Intangible, unobservable, and cannot be directly separated from any other natural bodily reaction. If your answer was soul, okay, sure. But have you heard of the concept called the subconscious? Of course you have. What if I told you that definition also applies to the subconscious? In that case, welcome to the theory so muddled in nothing and everything at the same time. Before anything, let us get one important fact straight. The specific concept of the unconscious or subconscious is not a creation of objectively studied phenomenon. Just like the soul, it was derived and pushed forward largely in philosophy up until the 20th century when it was integrated into psychology by crackpot extraordinaire Sigmund Freud. His brainchild, psychoanalysis, has been thrown on the wayside, and rightfully so. No matter how much has tried to be repackaged, Freud's theories have failed replication and, in some cases, even basic rudimentary building blocks to pass as a sociology study. In a National Library of Medicine literature review, in which they try to find any saving grace, the author decries this issue as, "The absence of solid and persuasive evidence for the theory may be the consequence of its self-imposed isolation from the empirical sciences." The philosopher Karl Popper considered psychoanalysis to be a pseudoscience because it has produced so many hypotheses that cannot be refuted empirically. That is the same issue that is carried on into the concept of the subconscious, or now commonly termed as unconscious in common parlance. All of its evidence is inferred, not observed. There is no direct measure of how conscious or unconscious a function is. It is merely inferred based on correlates or self-report. Even in PET scans or fMRI scans, the data is inferred and correlated to other theorized cognitive processes. That is ignoring the low sample sizes, usually a function of the nature of those two research methods. Hold up. That is not to claim correlates are always flimsy. It's solely a criticism of some weird loop, where we state a metric based on an inferred analysis of a concept largely philosophized and call it science. Nowhere in that entire stack do we actually have any objective data, but we simply carry it over. Procedurally, it's a much more sophisticated method than measuring a person's weight before and after death, then claiming the difference shows the existence of a soul. The final number might be an objective one, but the underlying theory is purely held within the realm of spurious beliefs. Back to the two histories. The concept of the soul reaches far back to the Homeric poems of the Greeks, wholly a philosophical level in which people tried to make sense of the living, the dead, and all that is related to the human existence. Karl Popper is famous for a quote in which he describes psychoanalysis had the scientific weight of a myth. The subconscious, as it was known then, also comes from philosophy. The term to describe the framework is said to first come from the German anthropologist Ernst Plattner in his book Philosophical Aphorisms in 1776. Geoffrey W. Schelling, another German, was recognized as the second philosopher to use the specific word in describing the concept in his book, System of Transcendental Idealism. From there, it passes through revisions before being picked up by Freud in his psychoanalysis. Both of them are underpinned by philosophy, not objective metrics. Both of them are built upon the same theories of self, with Schelling and Plattner drawing heavily from the concept of soul. Both deal with processing of emotions and reaction to the physical world. Whereas one was cast to the wayside as science moved forward, the other has been strangely embraced. So, we will continue digging through this new science which still fails iteration after iteration. In its split from Freud and its adoption into modern psychology, the theory was redefined from subconscious into its contemporary form known as implicit. Again, here we find another interesting tie-in. Notice that. Automatic, unlearned, natural reaction. There is functionally no difference between the two concepts other than the consensus in sociology on whether a behavior or inclination is natural born or learned. Sadly, that is rarely a scientific method. It's usually the equivalent of redefining an animal species not based on shared biological characteristics, but on the consensus of people who believe certain philosophies over others. How can I definitively make such a statement? 1. As stated before by multiple other psychoanalysts themselves, the concept's building block is barely science. 2. The replication crisis in social sciences, including cognitive psychology, means very few studies today still stand up to objective scrutiny. Thirdly, the new redefinition has been pushed into the world with more evidence against it than for it. This framework, which was rolled into the large banner of automatic or implicit cognitions, has spawned its own branches of failed theories. Two of its most prominent being memory and attitudes. We will ignore implicit memory as it's dealing with the least tangible aspect of this entire sequence, and one of its primary methods, widely known as priming, has failed every step of the way as a science, dragging a Nobel laureate down with its credibility. To the other one. The role of implicit cognition on general societal interactions built up steam in the 90s. A paper in 1995 by G. Greenwald and M. Banerjee is the main launch-off point, where they conclude that implicit cognition carried over from psychoanalysis is a valid inference, and now the next step is creating indirect measures for it. Interesting level of science there. They then followed up with the creation of the IAT, or the Implicit Association Test, in 1998. Let's just take a look at the first test of this very robust measure now used the world over. The sample size was 32 college students in the first and second experiment, 26 in the third experiment. The individuals were then given a set of adjectives or descriptors on a computer and told to sort them under a certain category. In the first experiment, they used flowers, insects, weapons, and musical instruments. And the descriptors for those two categories were used to measure bias. Second test used Asian American students to judge Asian American names, with their responses being the implicit bias. Third test used black and white names, and again their response there indicated something implicit. In all three of the tests, the speed was the measure of the unconscious cognition, but here is where it gets illogical. A questionnaire was the measure for explicit behavior. In simple terms, how fast you chose to assign an adjective in a computerized form was defined as implicit. Then filling out a different survey after the test was defined as explicit. And with that, it became one of the most cited psychology papers, launching its own specialized banner under Harvard on the same year, with a very interesting caveat at the bottom, about 5 panels away from the main page. Except it doesn't work. Not in meta-analysis, not even by its own researchers flip-flopping on the topic, and most importantly, not in any real-world data. The most crucial takeaway from this: even if I was to completely ignore all evidence against the theory and simply take it as it is, if I were to accept every claim made as factual, the evidence presented at the end doesn't show any internal processes of the mind and yields nothing about the actions in the real world. Simply hot air by its own standards. In the end, we are back regurgitating a repackaged 19th century philosophy with new lipstick and calling it a science. This is not to claim there isn't an innate human response somewhere beyond our normal cognition. But before we go off claiming we can fully measure it, can we at least get some grounded objective observations first? See you next chapter.